So I had never come across this topic until a few weeks ago, and I just had to share it with you guys. After Germany suffered a major defeat from World War I, a racist propaganda movement called the Black Shame was born. And this movement, it demonized the existence of French Black soldiers who occupied the Rhine. And if you're not familiar with why the French were occupying this area of Germany, it was part of the Treaty of Versailles, which was a treaty that Germany was forced into as a form of punishment due to their involvement in World War I. So the existence of these Black French soldiers, who were mostly from French colonies in Africa at the time, were the targets of this very racist, very sexist, and classist movement. Fake reports were made about African soldiers sexually assaulting white women, girls, as well as boys. And people who supported this movement became even more enraged when they learned that these French soldiers found love on the Rhine with German white women. And they started families together. They got married and they had children. And it was the children of these interracial relationships who would suffer under the Nazis' rule. So I want to just dive right into this topic now that I've given you an overview. But first, I do want to give a little disclaimer. So I know I briefly touched upon this up front, but I just want to put this in bold and highlight it. This topic is very sensitive in nature because I will be sharing very graphic, racist, and sexist imagery as well as language that was used during this movement to describe women as well as people who are part of the Black diaspora. So if you prefer watching something outside of this topic, I'm going to go ahead and just place one of my videos up top. If you haven't checked it out already, please do so. But if you want to continue with me in this video, let's get started. Prior to World War I, people of color lived very peacefully in Germany for the most part. Hundreds of young men from the Black diaspora, including Africa as well as the US, came to Germany as performers, students, and workers. And they settled in Germany and they married German white women and established families of their own without issue. With that being said, that doesn't mean that racist ideologies didn't exist in Germany before World War I, including other parts of Europe. Before these soldiers even set foot in the Rhineland, there were already very racist and preconceived notions about Black men, that they are these hypersexualized beings, a threat to white women, and that they are primitive from an evolutionary standpoint. And some of these ignorant assumptions are still believed today. Even though Germany had these racist ideologies about people of color, specifically Black people, they had not introduced institutionalized racism yet, which is when racist ideologies are literally embedded in the laws of the land. So it really wasn't until these Black French soldiers started to occupy the Rhine that we would see institutionalized racism in Germany. But why was France occupying the Rhineland? If you're not familiar with World War I and how things ended, I'll just give you a little brief recap because it is pertinent to understand the Black Shame movement and how it came about. The Rhine is an area in Germany that borders France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And when Germany lost World War I, they suffered a major defeat and were forced into a treaty called the Treaty of Versailles. And the terms of the treaty included Germany surrendering all their colonies, demilitarization of the Rhineland, Germany publicly acknowledging their guilt, a 100,000 man limit on Germany's army, and they could not use heavy artillery, tanks, or aircrafts. They also put limitations on their navy and forced them to pay 132 billion marks in reparations. And in today's money, in US dollars, that equates to about $269 billion. And so naturally, this put Germany in a very fucked up state. They were in a lot of debt, and it really impacted their economy. And all of this stuff I just listed as part of the agreement that they were forced into with the Treaty of Versailles. It's like half of the list. It goes on and on and on. This treaty was completely humiliating for a lot of folks in Germany. And that humiliation resulted in the Black Shame movement, and a lot of other things like World War II. And so France occupying the Rhine was part of this treaty. France was afraid of Germany, and so this occupation of the Rhineland gave France the security that they wanted. Prior to World War I, Germany was in a pretty good position. They were working their way up, trying to become one of the big powers in the world. They had a rising economy and a larger military force than France as well. And because of this, France needed to find soldiers. They realized that their military force was not as large as Germany's. And so France decided to employ soldiers from their French colonies in Africa as part of their force. They had soldiers from Northern Africa, Senegal, the Philippines, as well as Vietnam. And so it was these same soldiers that would occupy the Rhine. However, the name of the movement is called the Black Shame Movement. Even though it has that name, it wasn't just Black soldiers who were treated poorly and demonized in the media. It was also soldiers from the Philippines and Vietnam as well. However, it was African soldiers who dealt with most of this. And you'll see here shortly, because I'm going to show you some really disturbing images that was born from this propaganda movement, and most of it consists of Black men. Everything I found pretty much consisted of Black men. And while stationed on the Rhine, a lot of these soldiers fell in love with German white women, and they had interracial families. By the 1930s, anywhere from 400 to 1,000 children were born from these interracial relationships. And appalled racist Europeans were just disgusted with the existence of these relationships and the interracial children that they were creating. And as a result, these children, they were ostracized. And this was interesting because I've heard many derogatory terms specifically to describe biracial people, biracial children. I've never heard this before. They called the act of these interracial couples producing children as mulattoization. I mean, I've heard mulatto before many, many times. I'm an archivist. I've worked with archival materials that are based in the antebellum South, and so I am familiar with the term even before working with archives, but I have never in all my years heard of mulattoization until now. They also called it syphilisization. Syphilisization? But yeah, so anyway, they called it the mulattoization and the syphilisization of the German nation. Bars? Is that bars? It might be bars. And so the white German women who, of their own volition, decided to have a relationship with these Black French soldiers were also demonized for their choices, for who they decided to fall in love with. However, there were a lot of fake news reports coming out stating that there were Black soldiers on the Rhine sexually assaulting white women. And these fake stories would result in what would become the Black Shame movement. Now, while most, if not probably all of these reports were made up, that's not to say that sexual assault never happened on the Rhine. And it wasn't just fake news reports that they created. They also made postcards, they created plays, medallions that had elements about the Black Shame movement. They even made a coin. I am not kidding you, a freaking coin. And on these objects, it was usually Black men assaulting white German women. And here is that coin that I mentioned. As you can see here on the front, we have what is supposed to be an African man with extremely exaggerated features to try to make him appear ape-like. Yep, they did that. And on the flip side of the coin, we see here an angelic, innocent, pure German white woman who is tied to a post, which is a dick. The post is a dick. You can see the nutsack nestled at the base, the shaft, and his helmet represent, well, you know what his helmet represents. You get the picture. And this dick is supposed to represent the genitals of the Black man. Someone designed that coin. Someone reproduced that coin. Someone collected those coins. Let that sink in. Just let it marinate. There's so much detail here, especially on the nutsack. And you know what? I'm just gonna move on because there is so much to unpack here. Like, don't even get me started on the front of that coin because that could be a whole video, okay? Here's some more imagery that was created to fuel this propaganda movement. As you can see, it is always what they consider to be the barbaric black man assaulting the pure and innocent German white woman in some form or fashion. And quite frequently, the men are depicted as ape-like creatures. This is not new. This is common in minstrel shows and a lot of other extremely racist creations of the time. But this imagery is more than what meets the surface. There is meaning behind this trash. It was symbolism for how Germans felt about the state of their country at that time. Black shame campaigners equated the honor of the German woman to the honor and integrity of Germany as a nation. White German women were supposedly being sexually assaulted by Black French soldiers, and the nation, all of Germany, was being assaulted by France. And obviously, this movement was extremely racist. That's the whole point of it. However, it was also extremely sexist, if you haven't already gathered that from what I've shown you thus far. The women in these images are always victims of extreme sexual violence. And women who chose to be in relationships with Black men were ostracized, and they were seen as impure, almost like a whore shaming type of situation. Actually, not even almost like, it was. These women were seen as nothing but objects of reproduction to ensure the purity of the white race. And so having sexual relations with Black soldiers meant they were no longer clean. It was like their reproductive organs had to be safeguarded for the betterment of the nation, to ensure that their race, their lineage remained pure. And this movement was also extremely classist as well. Working class women were considered to be the most likely to pursue an interracial marriage. Some historians have pointed out that these very sick and twisted sexual acts of violence that are depicted by these men in these different images and objects are really just an outlet for their own sick and twisted fantasies. They're really sharing what is dark and deep inside of themselves that they want to do to these women, all the while hiding behind the guise that these Black soldiers are the ones who want to hurt these women. And it's not a ridiculous assumption to make, because a lot of these stories that they would make up are like extremely gruesome and very vivid and detailed. I mean, that came from somebody's imagination, and they enjoyed sharing it. They enjoyed making up this lie and really going into detail as to how this imaginary woman was violated. It's really sick. The people who were at the head of this propaganda campaign really wanted to gain international support for this supposed movement. And to accomplish this, they published fictitious stories about supposedly real instances of Black soldiers sexually assaulting white women. And these stories eventually made their way into other parts of the world, including England as well as the US. An English journalist and member of parliament, as well as a key figure in the Black shame movement named Edmund de Morel, published a couple articles in the Daily Herald in April of 1920. In these articles, he spoke out against the French occupying the Rhine, and he also spoke out about the presence of Black soldiers. He titled one of his articles, "Black Scourge in Europe, Sexual Horror Let Loose by France on Rhine, Disappearance of Young German Girls." He also published a pamphlet called The Horror on the Rhine, and it sold over 10,000 copies within the first month of publication. And now I would like to share with you an excerpt from Morel's article. "Their primitive African barbarians, carriers of syphilis, have become a terror and a horror to the Palatinate countryside. The barely restrainable bestiality of the Black troops has led to many rapes, an especially serious problem since Africans are the most developed sexually of any race, and for well-known psychological reasons. The raping of a white woman by a Negro is nearly always accompanied by serious injury and not infrequently has fatal results. Again, I'm not going to sit here and unpack that. I'll let you unpack that. I'm too tired to unpack that. We all know what the issues were with all of that shit. But that is legit what was in that article. And through that really terrible article, Morell was able to gain a lot of support for the propaganda campaign in the US as well as in England and in other countries. And he was also one of the people responsible for spreading fictitious stories of Black soldiers supposedly sexually assaulting these women. And these stories were usually fed to him by German officials so he could spread the good word. Now, men weren't the only disturbing individuals who supported this movement. There were women, specifically one woman I can think of, and her name was Ray Beveridge. Beveridge was a German-American woman who was also one of the biggest supporters of the Black Shame movement. She was the creative mind behind many articles, pamphlets, and protests. She also publicly demanded lynching Black men who lived on the Rhine. Now, when World War II rolled around, an estimated 10,000 people of African descent just disappeared. And many of these people were biracial African Germans who Hitler called Rhineland bastards. At one point, there were records of them, census information in Germany of these 10,000 people existing, and then all of a sudden, the records were gone. They just disappeared. Hitler felt as though biracial Germans were an abomination and that they represented the tainting of the Aryan race. In his infamous book, Mein Kampf, Hitler states, "The Jews were responsible for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland, with the ultimate idea of bastardizing the white race, which they hate, and thus lowering its cultural and political level so that the Jew might dominate. For as long as a people remain racially pure and are conscious of the treasure of their blood, they can never be overcome by the Jew. Never in this world can the Jew become master of any people except a bastardized people." The Nazis believed that the Jews concocted a plot to destroy Germany by introducing interracial procreation, which in their minds would result in the degeneration of the German race. In 1937, Hitler had 400 biracial children pursued by the Gestapo and local police, and taken to doctors to be sterilized to prevent them from being able to reproduce in the future. And they were usually given no anesthesia for this forced procedure. This was a fate of a lot of children of African descent living in Germany at the time. And it doesn't end there. A lot of interracial families were forced to break up. And that was if they didn't flee in time before the Nazis got to them. Black women were sterilized against their will shortly after giving birth. And typically they were not even aware that they were being given this procedure. And mothers of biracial children were in constant fear of losing their child because the Nazis were forcing white women to leave their Black families behind. And many of the surviving biracial children were also stripped of their citizenship. It's just a sad story, you know. I'm not really surprised that this event happened, but I'd never heard of it. I went to an all-Black school in Baltimore City, and we never learned about stories like this. And so typically when you learn about World War I, they don't talk about this type of stuff. And even with World War II, when people talk about the Holocaust, they usually don't talk about how it affected people of color, specifically people of African descent. This was a very educational topic for me personally. I learned quite a bit, and I hope you did as well. And I also want to say this, I am not trying to minimize what happened to the Jewish population. What the Nazis did was an abomination and just the most disgusting thing a human being could even think of doing to another. But we should also be aware of how World War II, specifically the Nazis, affected other groups as well, especially minority groups. And while I understand a country not being fond of another country who's their enemy occupying their territory, that freaking sucks. At the same time, I felt like this campaign really didn't have a lot to do with that. I mean, if you were more so concerned about just being occupied by another country, color really wouldn't have anything to do with it. A lot of their concern was feeling as though people of color were above them, were in a place of authority. And so that was just too much for them to handle. Not being occupied by another country, but being occupied by people of color. And just the thought of these families being torn apart just makes me sick to my stomach. I can't even imagine what that feels like. And all of this because of the sexual insecurities and prejudices of others. For instance, that ridiculous coin that I shared, all I see on that is just insecurity, not just racism and ignorance, but literally just insecurity all over that coin. And then also thinking about the forced sterilization and the thousands of missing people who just vanished. That type of shit gives me chills. So that's the end of this video. I know it was a pretty depressing topic, but I hope you learned something new. Just a little update. I am moving within the next couple of weeks or so, 1,000 miles away. And so, as you are already aware of, I'm sure moving is very stressful, but I want to make sure that I do get at least one video up before I move. I want to stick to that. So hopefully it'll be up within the next couple of weeks after this one. But if there is a little gap after that one, that's because I'm moving. And for the handful of people who enjoy my content and look forward to it, I will be back. I just need to get situated in a new state. And so until then, I will see you in the next video. Bye. Have become a terror and a horror to the Palatinate, God damn it.
Palatinate.
Palatinate.
Palatinate or Palatinate.